Clement's alarm went off at 6:30, which was already a crime against humanity. But the real insult was that he'd been awake since 5, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing his misery. Another day of being Godfrey the humble cooper. Another day of demonstrating barrel-making to tourists who would absolutely not retain a single fact about riveting staves. Another day of saying, "Aye, good morrow, wouldst thou care to see how we fashion the hoops?" in that terrible pseudo-medieval accent his supervisor Philippa insisted sounded authentic. He hauled himself out of bed with all the enthusiasm of a man trudging to the gallows. His feet hit the floor. See, still worked. Legs still bent. Technically capable of another day. The problem wasn't his body. It was his soul, which had apparently filed for early retirement sometime around Tuesday. The walk to the Heritage Village took him past the old hornbeam hedge that marked the boundary of the Blackwell estate. Clement had walked this route for 3 years, and he'd never really looked at the trees. This morning, feeling particularly theatrical about his own suffering, he actually stopped. The hornbeams looked about as tired as he felt. They'd been hacked back brutally each winter. Pollarded, the technique was called, and yet here they were again, sprouting new growth like suckers who hadn't gotten the memo about giving up. Their trunks were twisted and muscular. The bark rippled like clenched fists. "At least you don't have to wear pantaloons," Clement told them. The trees did not respond, which was probably for the best. By 7:45, he was in the changing room, pulling on the rough linen shirt that never got any softer, no matter how many times the village laundry maiden had washed it. The village laundry maiden was actually a 19-year-old named Saskia. The leather apron, the wooden clogs that gave him blisters in new and creative locations. His colleague Rufus was already in full costume, somehow managing to look cheerful. "Big day," Rufus said. "Is it?" Clement asked. "Is it a big day, Rufus? Because from where I'm standing, it's the exact same day we had yesterday, and the day before that, and—" "School group coming in," Rufus interrupted. "Year 5s. 40 of them." Clement closed his eyes. Year 5s were 10-year-olds. 10-year-olds asked questions. Endless questions. Questions like, "Did you have toilets?" And, "What if somebody got diarrhea?" And, "Is that a real rat?" "I need a different job," Clement muttered. "You're a trained actor," Rufus pointed out. "You literally went to drama school." "Yeah, and I'm using those skills to their fullest potential by saying, 'Mind thy fingers near the blade,' 800 times a day." The morning proceeded exactly as Clement had predicted, which somehow made it worse. He demonstrated the draw knife. He explained coopering. He stayed in character even when a tourist asked if he'd ever been on telly, which wasn't even a medieval question, and Philippa had been very clear that breaking character was grounds for a written warning. By 11 o'clock, he was leaning against the old hornbeam tree in the village square, the one they kept as a historic specimen. It had probably been there 200 years. Its trunk was massive and deeply furrowed, the wood so hard it had bent nails when someone had tried to put up a sign once. Clement related to this tree on a spiritual level, still standing, still doing its job, absolutely hollow inside. "You look like death," said a voice. He opened his eyes. It was Margot, who played the alewife and was generally too sharp for her own good. "I'm contemplating my life choices," Clement said. "Well dressed as a medieval tradesman and leaning against a tree. That's very method. I'm seriously considering applying to be a software tester. Do you know what software testers do? They click buttons and report bugs. The same buttons. Every day. And somehow that sounds more appealing than this." Margot studied him. "You know what your problem is?" "Enlighten me." "You're not actually tired. You're bored. It's different. Feels very similar on the inside." "Then stop phoning it in," she said. "You're not even trying anymore. You're like a wind-up toy running down." Before Clement could formulate a sufficiently withering response, a child's shriek split the air. The year fives had arrived, and they had somehow gotten into the grain store and released approximately 3 dozen chickens. Chaos erupted. Chickens bolted in every direction, feathers exploding, children screaming with delight and terror, Filippo shouting about insurance liability. The blacksmith abandoned his forge. Saskia emerged from the laundry with suds in her hair. Clement watched a particularly deranged hen streak past him, pursued by 2 boys wielding sticks. And then, he couldn't explain it. Something shifted. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity. Maybe it was Margot's words still stinging. Maybe it was just that chasing poultry required actual focus, actual presence, actual energy. And once he started moving, his body remembered it could. He lunged for a chicken. Missed. Tried again. Got one cornered near the hornbeam hedge, the tree's low branches creating a natural barrier, and actually managed to scoop the frantic bird into his arms. "Godfrey has captured the beast!" he bellowed in his best theatrical voice, not the dead monotone he'd been using all morning. The children went wild. He handed the chicken off and dove for another one. Rufus was laughing so hard he could barely function. Even Philippa looked faintly amused behind her clipboard. After 20 chaotic, ridiculous, utterly unpredictable minutes, Clement ran and shouted and improvised and actually performed. Not the script, not the demonstration, but something real and spontaneous and completely stupid. When the last chicken was secured and the year fives were finally herded back onto their bus, Clement stood in the square, sweating through his linen shirt, out of breath. He felt awake. "See," Margot said, appearing beside him. "Not tired, just bored." Clement looked at her, and then at the hornbeam tree with its stubborn, twisted strength. Then at the village that suddenly seemed less like a prison and more like, well, a stage. "Same time tomorrow?" Rufus called. Clement surprised himself by grinning. "Aye," he said. "Wouldst thou expect otherwise?" The hornbeam tree has this quiet kind of strength. It's been growing in hedgerows and forests for centuries, often pollarded, cut back severely season after season, and it just keeps growing. New shoots, new leaves, year after year. Its wood is so dense and hard that before metal became common, people used it for gear wheels in mills, for mallets, for ox yokes, things that had to endure constant strain. There's something about that persistence, that capacity to keep going even when you've been doing the same thing forever. Dr. Edward Batch noticed this tree in the 1930s when he was developing his system of flower essences, and he matched it to a state many of us know too well. That mental exhaustion that appears before the day even starts. Not because you're physically tired, your body's fine, but because the thought of the routine ahead just drains you. He called it the hornbeam state. It's what Clement was experiencing. That weariness of anticipation, that doubt about whether you have what it takes to face another identical day. And then, often, once you actually begin, you discover the energy was there all along. The Hornbeam Flower Essence is for that specific moment, when you need support moving from reluctance into engagement, when you need to reconnect with your own capability. Thanks for joining me today. If you enjoyed today's story, please give it a thumbs up and join me again next week for another Flower Essence-inspired story. See you next time.